Vice Chair Duncan, we are live on the stream.
Very good. Well, let's go ahead and start so that we can keep moving. We have a lot to cover. First, I want to welcome everybody and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, taking your afternoon to be with us. Um, we're picking up from where we were from our last meeting. We got a lot of work done at the last meeting, and I think several people commented how productive they thought that it was and how meaningful the discussions were. Since that time, there's continued to be a lot of work. Our task force in the field, which consists of 18 members from all 8 districts and includes testing directors, chief academic officers, and principals. And it includes uh, representatives from traditional schools, charter schools, and lab schools. So we're really covering the waterfront in as efficient way as we can. And as I say this, I recognize Janet, one of our co-chairs, also here, and I think Jill is going to try to also join us. We are um, very appreciative of the work they've done, and it will be reflected in some of the discussion that you hear today. After they did a great deal of work on the primary topics that you've seen and read about from the materials that were sent out, which have been focused on the areas of achievement, graduation, and growth, our DPI task force members from all appropriate areas of work within the department have then looked at the work they've done and also gone to work on it. And there's been a lot of internal working, a lot of taking the data and trying to analyze that in connection with the various things that are being proposed, first by the comments by the task force, or taking those to heart, then from the field, and then trying to look at what data suggests. And so as a result of that, we're going to have a report on these 3 items today as our first area, which would be achievement, then graduation, then growth, as indicators for accountability. We have talked about other indicators that will be the subject of future meetings. That is, other indicators that should be included. And it's important to note that. And we're going to talk about future meetings at some point as we get further into this meeting. I think it's important to say that there's not going to be any voting today. I know some people had expressed some concern about what we would be voting on exactly and whether or not we would be really prepared to, quote, take a vote. What we'd like to do is see if there's some consensus around certain values that are being articulated or characteristics that are being articulated. So if we can work to some consensus, that allows our field worker, the work that's being done in the field, and the work that's being done at DPI to progress in an even more focused manner. And that will be very beneficial to us as they come back to us with the work that they are doing, following up on our meetings. Um, so at this point, that sort of serves as an introduction of where we're going. We are going to try to also discuss aggregation today. You've got a paper about aggregation of data to review. We hope to have sufficient time to have some discussion of that. But our first and foremost task is to discuss the work that's been done on these 3 primary areas. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rupin for a further introduction, and then we will go to Curtis Sonneman, who will start us down the road of the work that's being done in explanation and be available to respond to your questions as we go forward.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to our third meeting of the State Board of Education's Accountability Task Force. As we begin today, I want to take a moment to reflect on the journey that we've been on together. In your first meeting, we focused on the why. We discussed our vision for North Carolina students and graduates, and you developed a theory of action that describes how an accountability system can continue to uh, contribute towards improved opportunities and outcomes for students. In your second meeting, you focused on the how, and you identified the design principles that should guide the development of a revised accountability system. Those principles represent your shared values and priorities, what you believe an accountability system should emphasize, protect, and incentivize. Today, you begin exploring the what, and you will consider indicators and approaches to aggregation that could ultimately comprise an accountability system aligned to the vision and principles you have already established. And as you do this work, I want to pause and remind you of the task force's charge. Your role as a task force is not to design every technical component of the accountability system, or make final decisions about formulas, measures, or calculations. Rather, the role is to provide direction and establish parameters. You are identifying what matters most in an accountability system, what outcomes you want to prioritize, and what guardrails should shape future decisions. There are other players in this space, including the Department of Public Instruction and the North Carolina State Board of Education. DPI will take the direction and parameters you establish and examine specific options for reliability, validity, feasibility, and implementation within the North Carolina context. Those technical analyses and recommendations will then go before the State Board of Education, which of course has the responsibility for making final decisions about accountability system recommendations. In many ways, you can think about this work similar to that of architects establishing a vision and design requirements. You are defining the purpose, priorities, and essential characteristics of the system. DPI's role is to determine which technical approaches can successfully realize that vision, and the state board's role is to make final policy decisions. And so I would suggest as we move into the work in front of you, um, that the theory of design and principles, design principles, they're not separate from your charge. They are, in fact, the clearest expression of the charge. And so your theory of action tells us what we want accountability to accomplish. Your design principles tell us how we believe the system should operate and the trade-offs that you are willing to make. Together, these documents provide the direction and the parameter that should guide every subsequent decision. And so as you engage in the work today, as you engage in the work moving forward, always ask yourself, particularly today with indicators, does this indicator help advance the outcomes described in the theory of action? Does this approach align with our design principles? As you look at today, and I will back up for a moment, to remind you that all of the work you have done in the past is housed in one area, in one website, and you can find that at this link that is provided on the screen. If you would like to have your phone take a picture or however it works to get to the link, or you could probably just hopefully click the link once we send you the actual PowerPoint. But I encourage you again to bookmark this link. All of the resources that are sent prior to meetings and after meetings will be housed at this location. And as you look at the agenda for today, you will be looking at recommendations both from an external working group as well as an internal DPI working group. These are, as the vice chair noted, around extended graduation cohorts, achievement, and then growth. And then as we get to the end of the day, we're going to begin a discussion around aggregation and putting all of this together. Our outcomes for this task force, we've looked at this before. We have it here as a reminder, and these are developed directly from engagement with this task force over the first several meetings. But today specifically, I wanted to remind us of how the task force and these working groups relate to one another. In recognition that this task force could not meet on a weekly basis, and also in recognition that we want to continually hear voices from the field, as the vice chair described earlier, we have a cadence where the task force acts first and the work group responds, to which the task force then does additional work and the work group responds. I think it's important that you remember that when the working group brings a recommendation to this task force, it is not with the idea that the task force should adopt that recommendation necessarily. As a matter of fact, as you look at the three recommendations today, you'll find one that the DPI internal working group did not agree with and recommends that the task force not accept. And so the working group is really there as a resource and as technical actors who deal with accountability systems on a more regular basis and can do deeper work and come back to this task force with both information and recommendation. And these two entities are set up and the meetings were scheduled on a very intentional cadence. And so you can see here in this slide more detailed breakdown of what work is being done by which group at which time. And we'll come back to this slide later. But we wanted to just sort of give this framing and have some reminders of where we are and what we are doing as we move into today's work, which I believe is very important work. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Curtis Sonneman, who is going to transition us from this framing into the first order of business.
Thank you, Rupen. As we see on this slide, we just want to remind us all that our focus is on the Big A accountability, our state accountability system, and its use of identifying schools that are in most urgent need of support and improvement. And that is different from Little A accountability, which includes the public reporting of information about school quality, but isn't used to identify schools. So we're continuing to work on that Big A accountability and identify those things that remain Little A accountability. Next slide, please. So our goals for today, as we look at the recommendations that are coming from the working group, are a review of graduation rate, particularly the inclusion of an extended graduation rate into the accountability system, a discussion about achievement, and then a discussion around growth as an indicator. And so there will be time later for future voting, but what we're trying to attempt today is to identify consensus to guide the future state accountability system design and continue allowing that work to move forward as we review and refine these and get to a final product at the end of the year. So as we move into the next slide, we're going to review those recommendations. We're going to do them. They're not in the same order as you received in your documentation. We're going to put them in the order of graduation, achievement, and then growth. So you may have read them differently, but we're going to try to move through them in that way. So as we move to the next slide, and we look, this is just a reminder of the design principles that have been established, and the link for the design principles is available there. And thank you, Carla, for posting it into the chat so that if you want to access it, it's available to you there. On the next slide is the document that would include these summaries and recommendations that were sent out, and those will also be available for you to look at. So as we move on to the next slide, well, as we're going to go through each of these, we're going to do a reminder of the discussion that was held by the task force and the current indicators that North Carolina has to measure these. We're also going to have an opportunity to ask clarifying questions about some of the recommendations or the feedback that DPI has provided and allow for some whole group discussion around this, and then consider some next steps, which would be to provide guidance to the work group, back to the work group, or directly to NCDPI to continue research or discussion on a topic. And if we can reach consensus, we would proceed with some analysis and simulations for these items. So the first one we're going to review today is extended graduation rate. And as we look at the extended graduation rate, currently North Carolina uses only the 4-year cohort graduation rate in the accountability system. There was discussion, next slide please. There was discussion during task force meetings regarding the use of the extended cohort graduation rate within the model. And can you go back up one more, Rupen, to 16? Thank you. Perfect. And so this item did not go to the work group for discussion. We felt as though this was something that the task force had pretty definitively defined as something that was desired, and that was the inclusion of the 5-year adjusted cohort graduation rate into the system. So the recommendation would be that North Carolina Department of Public Instruction consider using both the 4-year and 5-year graduation rates as a graduation rate measure in the accountability system. And the feedback that we gathered from within DPI is that we support the inclusion of both the 4-year and 5-year cohort rates into the accountability system. And when we get to the point of considering weighting or aggregation of this measure, that the 4-year rate would have more weight than the 5-year rate inside the system itself. So using both measures and weighting the 4-year cohort graduation rate with more weight. So on the next slide, we open it up to you to see what questions you might have about this recommendation or other things that you want to weigh in on regarding it, and what guidance you want to offer to us in terms of next steps.
You speak of, I believe you spoke of here of using the 4-year, weighting it heavier. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, applying more weight, saying if we're combining the two together, the 4-year has more weight. It has more importance in the calculation. So adding more weight to it, like we could treat it like we're all used to with an 80-20. We would say 80% of the weight is the 4-year rate and 20% is the 5-year weight. We may go closer to the middle on that, but that would be certainly something we can explore to identify what that weighting does. But we're just recommending for our conversation that we feel as though the 4-year should have more weight than the 5.
Just one more question. I know you collect that 5-year cohort already. Do we know what percentage of children that is?
Yes, we do collect that and report it. It is about generally it's 1 to 2 percentage points higher at the state level than the 4-year rate, but that varies by school. Some schools, based on their programs, may have a significantly higher 5-year rate because they engage the students to stay longer and complete that, where they're not necessarily completing at a 4-year rate. You might think of that at maybe an alternative school would have that ability to do that. So that would help those schools to have that 5-year rate in that model,
Right.
To boost up that graduation rate indicator.
Right.
Other questions?
Hey, it's Elena. Thanks, Curtis, for the intro on this piece. Can you clarify procedurally, if this were to move forward, would this group then review the weights or the difference in the model for 4-year and 5-year cohort graduation rates?
I don't know if it would be exact. We may come forward with some suggestions for what we're looking at for weighting. I think we would hear from you all that we're providing the feedback that we recommend it be the 4-year rate. I think we would like to hear from you all on if you feel like one should be weighted more than the other, if you feel that that is the case, or you feel that it should be the 5-year rate should have more weight. But our recommendation is to maintain that 4-year rate.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I'll just share that, I was a high school principal, and having the 4-year cohort graduation rate was critical to making sure that we were getting kids across the stage in 4 years. I would have concerns about any model that incentivizes getting a kid across the stage in 5 years instead of 4 years, because it will change behavior in a way that lowers expectations, in my opinion. If you think about the fact that current graduation requirement is 22 credits, and we have a block schedule system in North Carolina where kids are taking 8 courses a year, that means in 4 years, they can earn up to 32 credits. And some of our kids are taking classes in the summer. So in my opinion, I think that the weight should be significantly on 4-year cohort graduation to ensure that our level of expectation is that we're getting kids across the stage in 4 years, because that's what's best for them. And we should be able to do this and to do it fairly well. I say that also having worked with many kids who maybe did need the 5th year. And so I don't think schools should be penalized. And this is outside of my area of expertise in terms of like the calculation here, but I would be concerned about any system that effectively takes us backwards in incentivizing a 5-year graduation rate versus a 4. I think the emphasis needs to significantly remain on 4-year graduation rate, and then maybe give them some bonus points if like they can additionally get some kids high school diploma in the 5th year if
They don't have the
needed.
senator emails. It's not the end of the world. It's more like our staff.
So Elena, you have hit on, this was the tenor of the discussion that DPI had as well. And the tension not tension, but the balancing act is to continue to incentivize 4-year graduation, but then also incentivize continued work with the student when 4 years is not possible, continuing to push that student to get across the stage even in a 5th year. But this is precisely the sort of technical, the testing that we would want DPI to have that freedom to do, to understand what is the right weighting that would achieve the prioritization of 4-year graduation, but also incentivizing districts to continue pushing students who are not able to do it within 4.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask a question for the group. Are there anyone in our group who wants to strongly advocate for one of two things? Advocate that we don't include 5-year cohort at all, one possibility, or alternatively weight 5-year cohort equally or in some way. We're talking about a lesser weighing of the 5-year cohort. Does anyone thinks that weighing should be greater on one side, or on the other side thinks we shouldn't have a 5-year cohort involved at all? Just to sort of move to the process of seeing what consensus we have.
I'm in favor of having that opportunity, but I agree. I don't think it needs to be weighed nearly as high as 4 years. Does that answer your question?
It does. Is there anyone has a different view than what Lynn just expressed? And if not, we may be reaching a consensus point on this, which will be helpful, and let us move on to the next item.
I don't have any difference of opinion. I want to, maybe remind everyone that if a student is going through an elementary school or a middle school and they are held back a year, those schools are not penalized for holding a student back. And if it's a middle school comprised of grades 6 through 8, and it takes that child 4 years to get through the middle school, there's no penalty for that school or that student for taking 4 years to get through the middle school. We're now allowing students to graduate in 3 years, and that incentivizes some students who are disengaged. We're allowing students to graduate at 4, and we're allowing students to graduate at 5. So I feel like it honors the fact that all students move at different paces, through their educational continuum. And I think we need to be mindful of that. I do agree that the 5th year should not carry as much weight, but I don't feel like a school should be penalized if they're getting the students across the stage, because that's our goal, is to graduate our students ready to be successful at their next stage of life.
I would agree with that. I just wonder how the 5-year cohort might impact early colleges. Because in our county, we have a 5-year program. And of course, through that, they get a high school diploma and a community college diploma. How does that fit in?
I can address that question. The early colleges are already able to indicate that students that stay for that 5th year, as long as they meet the minimum state requirements, they are counted in the 4-year cohort graduation rate already positively, right? So as long as they've met the minimum requirements by the end of the 4th year, they are considered a graduate for the cohort. Then they would be expected to have their diploma at the end of the 5th year. So those early colleges are already being marked. Students who stay, we're still treating them as if they have met the requirements and their graduation rates remain high. So there's not a negative impact on those early colleges.
And
Is it important to explain there that when they're in the 5th year, they're getting not just their high school diploma, they're also getting their Associate of Arts degree from the community college at the same time?
That's correct.
And those who graduate in 3 years just count in the 4-year.
That's right. They count in the 4-year when they get there. I mean, and also note that the 5-year cohort graduation rate counts all of those kids that graduated in the 4-year. They stay in the denominator for the 5th year. What we're picking up here is students who additionally graduate in that 5th year.
All right, are we near consensus here on this point? That it sounds like we are. Anyone want to chime in with any other consideration we should take up? All right, Curtis, let's go back to you. Next area.
Thank you. This one, we're going to talk about achievement. We're going to go back to review. There are 2 different things on the next slide. There are 2 different things about achievement that that the task force has discussed. We're only going to focus on one of them today, but just to remind us of what was discussed, there was the what. So what is tested and included in academic achievement? For example, reading, math, science, other assessments, other pieces of information that we would consider for achievement, spanning grades and content areas. And then the how. How do we measure achievement within the context for the accountability system? And so today we're going to focus on the how. But for the what, we talked about, next slide, please. Thank you. For the what, we currently have reading and mathematics and science assessments, both at the elementary, middle, and high school, that are included in our accountability system. The task force has asked the work group to review on the next slide the possibility of including other assessments, and that discussion is ongoing. That will come to you at a later time as we continue to flesh out those discussions. During the time we had with the working group, we didn't necessarily come to any sort of agreement on possible additions for achievement at this point in time, but we will certainly bring that to you in a future meeting. So as we focus on the next slide to the how, currently North Carolina uses the % of proficient students, so grade level proficiency on these various assessments that are rolled up to a total number of proficient students, which is the achievement effectively for elementary and middle schools. It's the achievement indicator within the accountability system at this time. So the task force was interested in exploring different measures beyond % proficient, such as a mean scale score or proficiency indice. So what we did with the work group is we brought them together to review these different ways of looking at things. Beyond % proficient, we looked at the mean scale score as well as what we refer to as a proficiency index. And in the information you received, next slide, please. The working group reviewed those different methodologies and came to a consensus on using a proficiency index to calculate achievement rather than % proficient. I'll mention the feedback and then I'll go into a little bit more detail from DPI. We support the idea of using proficiency indices because it allows differentiation for student performance within schools. So both groups are in agreement with that. So what a proficiency index is we would take each of the achievement levels. Right now we have 4 achievement levels, not proficient, level 3, level 4, level 5. Right now, when we calculate the accountability system, we use the percent of proficient students. With using an index, we would apply points to each of the achievement levels. Say, for example, we had 0 points for a not proficient student. We had 1 point for a level 3 student, 1.25 for a level 4 student, and 1.50 for a level 5 student. Those level 5 students would receive more points inside the system when we added up all of the students within the school that meet those different achievement levels. So what that allows schools to do and differentiate themselves, differentiate the schools, is that, say, for example, a school that has 2 schools have 85% proficient students. We would look at them as 85%. We would say those schools are the same. If we used a proficiency index and all of the students in one school were a level 3 and all of the students in another school were a level 4, those schools would look differently with that index. We would see one school with an 85 on their index, and then the other school would have a higher score because they were getting more points for their level 4 students. So we'd be able to differentiate, and that allows for more meaningful differentiation between schools as we look at their score points. So the idea of using a proficiency index is what the working group had recommended based on reviewing all of the different options, and we do support that. So I want to open up the floor to all of you to ask questions and get more information that you need to have further discussion.
All right. Any comments we have on this?
Just one quick question. So Mr. Solomon just mentioned the point values being 1 for level 3, 1.25, and 1.5. And that was different than what we originally had. Because my original question was going to be why a level 4 would get a 1.0 and 1.25 for level 5. Long story short, the original one we saw didn't have equal intervals, but what you just named had those equal intervals. Would there be a difference between using one versus the other?
So thank you for asking that question. At this point, we haven't established what those scores would be. Both of these are just examples. The one in the writing and the one that I mentioned are simply examples. We would need to go back and do some data analysis to identify how we can differentiate the schools and using which points to ensure that we're not masking information. Like if we gave too many points to a level 5, that could mask all of their students that are not proficient, and it would appear that they don't have any not proficient students within their school. So we have to go back and try to work through a whole bunch of different scenarios on what that would be before we would come forward within the accountability system and determine which point values would be assigned. So thank you for that. They're both just examples at this point. So there's nothing set in stone on what we would try to establish as point values at this point.
I'd just like to say that I totally support the work group's recommendation of using indices. I think it'd be a great idea, and I think they should move forward with some analysis.
All right, other thoughts? I'd like to raise a question to think about. So if you have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scale, for example, and 3 is proficient, 4 is award or higher, and 5 is award or higher, the 1 and the 2 that don't meet proficiency would be graded the same. some of the great work done by educators is to move a child from a 1 to a 2. It may not score on the proficiency scale, but it's given that child a much better chance to get to the proficiency scale. To me, not finding some recognition for some educators to do marvelous work, and more importantly, for their students to be advancing and getting to a place where they can continue growth, is an important marker. And I would like to see if this system would not find a way to mark those schools that are doing that kind of movement, even if it's not reaching proficiency yet, it is getting to proficiency, which is the step we need to reach proficiency. So I'm throwing that out for comment and thought by the group. And of course, by you, Curtis.
I agree with that idea that Mr. Duncan said. Certainly we have schools that are moving kids from 1s to 2s, doing remarkable work. And I know that when we talk about growth, that may come into play. But when we're talking about this, and I understand this is saying proficiency index, and I guess when we talk about proficiency, we're talking about a level 3. But I too would like to just see, what would it look like? What would it look like if you came back and gave, that you looked at the 1 and the 2s?
If I could go further.
Yeah, it's in the yeah. And I know you talk about it in the growth. And I think that's what, yeah.
If I could go further on this, one of the things that happens, I think, is there's a strong concentration. One of the things we want to do with this plan is our most high achieving students should be having rigor and should be advancing. And so the notion that pushing to get 5s and 4s is very important. It is. It's important that those students get pushed for rigor. But there seems to be an awful lot of time spent, and the educators can speak to this better than I can, on the 2s, trying to move them to 3s so that you can say their proficiency. And when that happens, there's some level, whenever you put an emphasis on a certain point in the system, it seems to me that has the potential effect of not observing the 1s in this case, where you're not really pushing because you don't have hope to get them to a 3 immediately in many cases. And so, there needs to be something built in for those schools to be recognized that they are actually moving students from a proficiency standpoint. Their proficiency is better. It's just not reaching the proficient levels we've established. And so I don't want us to just focus on the 2s. And I've heard all too often that there's an undue focus on the 2s and the 1s get lost in the wash. Can't have that. All our kids matter.
I'd like to comment if I could. Currently, our system, as I believe it, only has not proficient and then 3, 4, and 5. I believe we got rid of the 1s and 2s. Well, didn't get rid of. We no longer count. There's no such thing as a 1 and 2 anymore. It's not proficient. Then it's 3, 4, 5, which are all proficient. Are we considering going back to the system of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or how will we, in your vision of this, how do we recognize what's a 1, what's a 2? Because we have not proficient and then 3, 4, 5 currently.
Yeah, well, that's the question I'm raising. Do we want to take that into account, and that value any thoughts people have?
Yeah, that does seem to make sense, because while those point values certainly reward, in a sense, the students who are performing at the top, we also know that proficiency is very directly aligned with socioeconomic status as well. And if we're going to work to give credit, more credit for kids performing at the top, it seems that we should be able to at least offer partial credit for kids who are partway to proficiency.
And I would respond by saying I thought that's the purpose. When we get to growth, those students are recognized, and those schools who get their students to grow are recognized in some form. And I hope we have some form of growth model. So that's where those students are picked up at. This is in my opinion, is a proficiency index. So right now we're talking about those students who are proficient, and we certainly need to recognize, and that's why I like the index, because it does recognize those students who move from level 3, 4 to 5, and I do think we should recognize those students who grow, but that should be considered in a growth model instead of a proficiency model.
Well, couldn't it also be that we're giving partial credit for partial proficiency as opposed to every kid, regardless of how close they are to proficiency, would then get a 0?
Well, if I missed the EOG, how many students do you think in North Carolina 3rd grade didn't pass it because of 1 point? There's a whole bunch of them. I'm sure. And I understand that we're talking about proficiency, and I could go either way, but that child doesn't help their school one bit by this.
But it would help them in growth. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on if they grew. Depends on if they grew. And, you can talk all day. I could fight. I could go either way, but I'm just saying, having worked in a school where this happens, I hate to see that child, again, I understand we're talking about proficiency, and in this day and age, proficiency is a level 3, but what about the children that missed it by 1 point? They don't contribute to their school's index at all. I don't know. I just think it's something to think about.
I don't think I think we had to be very careful that our model doesn't reward socioeconomic status like was just mentioned. And we could, I think that in a lot of cases, that's what our model does now.
Yeah.
There's a lot of school systems that have, students, the majority of their population are, in poverty. They're facing a lot of obstacles that some of our schools don't face, and that school could be doing a tremendous job of moving those students and growing those students, still not getting high proficiency rates, and they're labeled as a D school. And then you have another school in the state that has, a lot of higher socioeconomic students within it with lots of opportunities and maybe not a lot of diversity, and those scores are a lot higher just because of where those students come from. And so are we really rewarding the teaching and learning that's going on in the schools, or are we just rewarding where those students came from?
And remember, this is one test.
Right.
This is one test on one day.
Yeah, and I like the way Don Phipps talked about that at our last meeting when we talk about the climate and the weather.
This is John Hood. I agree with that point in the sense that there's such a strong correlation between socioeconomic status and score that our current way we're weighting proficiency versus growth is questionable. But I would go back to the point that this is really about, do we want to focus on essentially an average score? I know that's not quite the right word, but basically take into consideration all of the different levels and come up with an index value, as opposed to everybody over a certain level. I would be hesitant to move away from anything that that doesn't put a strong emphasis on proficiency. Of course, the argument there could be, if we did this and we had the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as opposed to the only question is how far above proficiency are you? You can always still report the number that is at proficiency or higher. You can have multiple data points, and I think that's reasonable anyway. Is that like the difference between growth and proficiency? Instead of sweating the relative proportion of 20-80 or 50-50 or 40-60, we ought to simply be providing not 12 or 20 different measures that are confusing, but I think 2 or 3 measures is not confusing.
Just to follow up on your comments, we are required to provide the percent of proficient students. That is a federal requirement. We have to report out proficiency. We do not have to use that proficiency in the accountability system. We can use an index. So we are still required to provide the percent of proficient students within a school in our reporting in a school report card. That is all required. So that would not go away by using an index in the accountability system.
And I don't want anybody to think that I don't think proficiency is important. I totally agree with proficiency is very important, but I also am not blind enough to think that our schools across our state all come with very different starting points. And, if you're starting, 3 miles back versus someone who's starting right on the starting line, there's a difference in the amount of achievement that you're going to get in those schools. So I just feel like we need to take that into account. I like the profile filter approach that we read about in our material. And I think we could get the best of both worlds. I just think we've got to be careful about how we do it.
Yeah.
I appreciate those perspectives and this robust conversation. One thought I'm having though is that proficiency needs to mean something. And currently the way we're looking at achievement is compared to the standards of the grade level. And I think that's important to know. Did you master what is expected in this content? I understand the perspective of 1 third grader one day. I get all those aspects of it. But I do think it's a yes or no question on proficiency, depending on where you set the mark or not, is something that we do need to be able to define for parents to understand our students meeting the expectation for a grade level. Because as a parent, I would want that perspective. I ran my own school's numbers from this year's testing through this model just to see how it compared, and without the context of the rest of a model, it was hard to see. But what I have seen over time is that we are achieving more 4s and 5s because we have been pushing the rigor of the grade level standards and working towards that. So I think growth and achievement proficiency go hand in hand, and it's a moving target. It's not a one-day metric, but achievement should mean something.
Vice Chair Duncan, this is Jeff Coltrane with DPI.
Welcome, Jeff.
Great to see you all. This is a healthy, very robust discussion, and wanted to share, and Mr. Sonneman and Dr. Mayer would know more than I do, but I believe there are other states under their accountability system that have come up with measures that look at how schools move students from like a level 1 to a level 2 or level 2 to level 3 as another indicator in their accountability system. And I wonder if it would be helpful for the working group to explore how other states look at that as another potential indicator. So not something to replace what's being discussed now or the proficiency, but as something else for the task force to consider that might help to address this idea of how are we moving students closer to proficiency versus just looking at proficiency and above. Just an idea. And I don't know all the details on those other states, but I've heard about measures that other states are using in that realm. So.
And it was noted in the in the chat from Carla that Jeff is talking about a value table, which is a growth metric, not necessarily an achievement metric. So it would be a potential option for a growth model.
One more thing just for context as well. So all states measure proficiency, but the states don't define it the same way. And there was a group that put together what it would look like on a NAEP scale for proficiency across the 50 states. And North Carolina actually ranked as around number 8 in terms of where we set the bar for proficiency compared to most other states. And I'm not advocating for lowering that bar, but I think it could merit some context of if we create a model that just lumps together all the kids we're labeling as not proficient, we're missing some kids who in theory could be defined as proficient in other states. So if we're continuing to lump them together, it's almost like they're fighting 2 battles to be seen as proficient or any level to represent what they know if they're all labeled with a 0.
Well, this has been a good discussion. I don't want to cut anybody off. And I think the best thing to do is to refer the discussion back to the field groups, both in the, out in the, excuse me, the working groups out in the field and obviously back in DPI in terms of how we do this, both in terms of achievement and in terms of growth. How do we take into account these issues? I would frame it, if you had a school that had, the hypothetical school had 100% ones and moved all those kids to a 2, and you had another school that had 100% 3s and moved all those kids to a 4. Both of them did a phenomenally good job, but I'm not sure that the 1s to 2s wasn't a better job than the 3s to a 4, because that's how hard that work is. And so how we figure out how to note that and celebrate the achievement progress, not yet the proficiency progress, but the achievement progress, is, I think, worthwhile. And I think it matters to not just the morale of the educators who work so hard to get those differences, but also to the communities that want to celebrate real achievements and get behind the education of their children, because there are things to celebrate. So things they can see, feel, and touch about improvement with their children. So does anybody have a better idea for consensus as of the moment, trying to embrace this discussion?
Yes, yes, sir. I want to get clarification on the consensus I think we're reaching. Are we asking the work group to explore the indices, or are we? I just didn't know if we got to that point yet.
We're asking the work group to continue to explore the indices for proficiency and to take into account this discussion either for separate indices in some manner or for some indices that relates to growth.
Yes, sir. We have consensus, or at least I think so.
Anybody have different thoughts? All right. That's a complex area, so I look forward to the hard work that's going to come forward to give us the next things to consider on that. So, or the next iteration to consider. So, Curtis, I think we're ready. Please stop me if we're moving too fast off this subject. Curtis, if we're not moving too fast, that would move us to growth, which I think is the one we're going to need the most time on anyway. So let's
think,
head there.
Absolutely. I think we've kind of merged the two together a little bit.
We sort of did.
We've started to have that conversation that I think we can explore more here. And so,
can I just pop in? This is Jill. I think that's fine. We shouldn't say, oh, there shouldn't be any growth in the proficiency. I mean, in the academic achievement, it's okay if there's some growth reflected in there.
Okay. Thank you for that feedback. We're going to move into the growth. So let's just go back to setting the frame for this. We're setting aside the weight of growth within the system. We're really just talking about the growth, the indicator of growth. How do we get to that measure? Not that we'll talk more about weighting in future meetings and how all of these things interact with one another once we've established all the indicators. And so we'll go with that. That's part of that aggregation discussion that we'll have and get a little deeper in. Next slide. So there were two components to this one as well, both a what and a how. We are not coming forward with a what. We have not, like the achievement, we have not yet defined the what, or that we would like to bring the what for achievement and the what for growth, or what things are included in achievement and what things are included in growth at the same time to all of you. And so we're not prepared for the what. We are prepared to present the how, and the how would be what system we may use for measuring growth. And so if we look at the what, of course, is reading, math, and science. When we look at the next slide, the how, we currently are using an EVAS growth model, which is a value-added model. So in discussion with the, in discussion with the working group, we reviewed various models. There were three in particular that were reviewed. One is a value table, which we've already sort of hinted at with the achievement indicator as the way you're looking at that achievement could be considered a value table. Student growth percentiles was another one. And the third one is a value added growth model. EVAS is one of many value added growth models. So value added growth models take other components into consideration. They're very technical in nature, and they work to provide information for growth. The recommendation from the working group would be to consider continuing to use a value-added model, not necessarily EVAS, just a value-added model to calculate grades 3 through 8 growth in the state accountability system. The feedback as we reviewed it with the rest of the DPI team is that we recommend continuing to review all of the growth models that are available. There are some advantages to some other growth models, like providing additional information that is not currently available, and other models are more easily understood and transparent to users, and other state models can be reviewed to inform these decisions. What we heard from the work group is that while they are recommending a value-added model, they want a model that is transparent, they want a model that's easily understood, and they want a model that gives them more information, potentially at the student level. And so taking those three things into account, as things we also heard from similar things from the task force in terms of wanting to have something that's easier to understand, able to be more transparent in how it is done. We are looking for the opportunity for DPI to continue to review those different models and come forward with a recommendation for what model might suit all of those priorities that have been established by both the work group and the task force in this work. So if we move to the next slide, we'll open up the floor for questions that you might have regarding the discussions that were had and the recommendations and DPI's considerations, as well as other things that you would like us to do moving forward. So, Vice Chair?
The floor is open for commentary on this area.
Well, break the silence. I'll just say, having reviewed the materials and looked at this issue over time, I don't disagree that there are pros and cons to all the different options, and I don't see a compelling reason to move away from our value-added model. Again, you don't have to necessarily use precisely the same model, but not really persuaded that the other options are a net gain.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit as to what you see as the reason the other options are not as potentially desirable as the value-added model?
Well, in addition to the materials that were presented, we have been using this system for a long time. There should be a kind of everything else being equal, resistance to changing the design of the model of the way we do this too much because people are familiar with it. There are long-standing concerns about EVAS specifically, as one might expect, a system that's been in place this long and designed under different context in a different situation, that there have been arguments about it over the time. but I just don't really see a compelling case to change it. I think that's the way to think about it. It needs to be a compelling case, not just, well, I mean, we could try something else. There is a downside to that from the standpoint of parental confidence, familiarity by the educators and administrators using it, confidence among policymakers that this makes sense. We all know that this whole area is fraught with political and sort of activist peril. And you wouldn't want to have a change that was made simply for technical reasons be perceived as something else. So I just don't see a compelling case for it, but I recognize there are pros and cons.
That's helpful. Thank you. Other thoughts?
Well, go ahead.
Paul, I think you're muted if you're talking.
Thank you. I certainly would be open to exploring other models. And my rationale for that is because our current model is not transparent enough for the average parent or the average student to understand the model and how it's used in growth. If there's a way to make this easier for principals and parents to understand, I would certainly be I would be agreeable to any model that does that. But currently, the EVOS model as it is seen by the general public and by a lot of educators as some magic number that comes out of EVOS. I'd like to find something or have something that is more transparent. Even if we had a tool that would help us measure progress as we go through, because as it stands now, what we do is at the end of the year, scores come back, we hold our breath until the magic EVOS number comes out. I know there is a technical guide. I've seen the technical guide. Can't promise you I understand it all because I'm just a layman, but I would like to see something that would give parents and educators more information about how this is done in a way that they can easily and readily explain it to their parents and students.
I think well, I look at the comment on it's on page 5 in our report, where it says that this value-added models like EVOS, and I know we've used it for so long, are inherently difficult to compute locally without access to the students' entire school history. And you spoke to that, but I do know that the EVOS data, you can understand what it's telling you, but I think our principals and administrators have difficulty understanding all of it. And I'm just thinking, could we have something, I don't know, explore and see if there's other models or other ways to do this. Certainly it's been used for a long time. And even they say in this comment that without professional development, you don't know what it says.
I appreciate that perspective that you both have shared, and it can be confusing. I have one principal friend who calls it voodoo. However, there's a depth of information that can be very helpful to a principal beyond just looking at individual student growth, which is, really not the tool. It helps you see patterns in which teachers are most effective with which types of students. It helps you see patterns across years, which helps track the impact of curriculum choices and shifts in practice, or we use it with intention. And I do think it speaks to a need for making sure that we're empowering principals and teachers with tools and opportunities to learn how to use the tools. But having the data alone is not enough. It's what you do with it. And I would just argue that EVOS offers a rich set of benefits beyond just the role it plays in this model that can be very helpful to school leaders. One thing that I think
Becky,
of
I
this
think
are very impactful for teachers and principals, and the specifically with pay for our school leaders, but also it's important that these systems align with how we measure educator effectiveness in general. And so I think that's a very important part in the work for
I think we've lost Becky, but
yeah.
I would like to weigh in just so that we can have an understanding, so we're all in the same frame.
Hold on one
Yeah.
second, Curtis. Becky, you're back, and we missed the last thing you said.
I apologize. I'm at school with unstable internet, but I was saying that it's very important point that was in the working group notes is that we got to look at changes to any growth metric and how that impacts all of the systems, not just school accountability, which is just one use, but principal effectiveness and teacher effectiveness. And those things have to be aligned. And so I think that's an important consideration as we consider the alternatives.
Thank you. I'm glad we caught that last point. Curtis.
Yes, and to that point, I want to stress to all of us here, we are talking about a growth model for the accountability system. EVOS for use as educator effectiveness and its system tied to educator effectiveness that is supported by Dr. Tomberlin is not going away. The conversation that we're having is what would be the growth model that would be used in the school accountability system. Right now, they are linked to one another. That does not have to be the case, but and yes, as it was noted in the documentation that you've all had an opportunity to read, there was conversation within the work group about having potentially two systems of information out there. But to Becky's point, there's a lot of data that's available to educators within the EVOS system. It's how it is then used as for school accountability, where the public is seeing that and doesn't understand what a growth index score means and can't look in behind the curtain of all that restricted data that schools have access to get an understanding of the number that's provided to them. So that was part of that discussion. And so just to help all of us frame, EVOS would not go away for educator effectiveness. That remains separate from our discussion around the use of a growth model in school accountability.
This is Representative Johnson Hostler, so I'm glad you went before me, Curtis. So my question is, given the work groups talked about kind of, yes, they can still be connected in the way they are, or they could be separate. Are there models out that you all have looked at, will look at, that show us kind of are they using a value added growth model if they're separate? And if so, what is that? For me, again, as a parent, as a former school board member who had to hear from parents, I think everyone has said it, and I think Ms. Andrews has said it best. Parents are trying to sort through what does this mean, and yes, we are doing this for multiple reasons, right? Like it's a requirement, but ultimately, at the end of the day, I also think it's important that we're creating systems that every single person, regardless of what their connection to the school is, including parents, can describe, yes, my kid is proficient or not based on this, and here is what growth looks like. Because currently those things are so intertwined that I don't think any person you talk to outside of people who eat, sleep, and breathe this every day, like Becky just broke down, that even people in our school buildings don't have that level of information to share. And so I'm just curious, has someone done this in a way that we're not just throwing it all to the wall, but that we can look at to say, while they're not completely comparable to North Carolina, here are lessons learned that we can use to actually develop a model in North Carolina that makes sense, that is absolutely, I think Paul might have used the word that it's not clear, like that we're able to actually build out, that we can all feel comfortable that we made it relevant to North Carolina, but also relevant to the end user, which are parents and community.
Curtis, I think that's back to you.
Yes, I think that is something that we can look at, and I think that's where we're looking for the opportunity to explore those options that might allow for clarity for someone to say that growth, when we're looking at a school, is calculated in this way, and potentially, there are some models that do allow for more information. So a parent may receive more information. I know of at least one other state that uses a growth model that allows for a student level value. So a student may be able to see, or a parent may be able to see what that student's indicator of growth might be. Where in certain systems and in the current system that we have, student level data is not considered, but that.
And I have one, thank you. That's helpful. And so I have one follow-up to that. Um, do we also have states who separate these? And so do we have examples of states who says this is your proficiency grade and this is your growth grade?
In the accountability system, when we're
In
talking
the
about,
actually in the accountability system.
I would have to look back, but I believe there are one or two that might do reporting of, and that gets to a future discussion. That gets to that's a great segue into aggregation when we get there. That's
Okay.
the idea of what we might want our model to look like as we report data out. So that will be, hold that thought
I'll
for
put a pin in it.
aggregation discussion, and we can get there.
Okay, thank you.
And there's a question regarding when North Carolina began to use EVAS. Within certain school districts, I believe it was 2006. Statewide, we began to use EVAS as part of statewide reporting and accountability in 2013. So around 2012-13, when we had the Ready Accountability Model, we began to use EVAS as the state's growth model when we moved away from the ABCs of education and the growth model that was used there. So we've had growth for, and particularly EVAS growth for a long time.
I would like to speak in response to what Becky said. I agree with her. I was a principal in 2006, and so we started using EVAS before it became used by the state, and was able to make tremendous gains in my school. I was principal there for 9 years, and I think we exceeded growth 8 out of 9 years. And I credit that to the use of EVAS in my school. I do understand that to many people it is confusing and maybe not completely transparent, but I mean, we would use that data in IEP meetings. We would use that data with our students in the classroom with goal setting. We would use it in our PLC groups with our teachers. There, like Becky said, there's a lot of data within EVAS, and I think EVAS has continued to listen to our responses from the field about how to make it better, and they've responded to that, and I feel like they have continued to make it better. I would suggest before you just throw out the EVAS value added model and look at another one, would be to share the concerns of what some of the people are saying about what they would want more, to see if EVAS could give them what they're asking for, or help them understand it better. You know, maybe maybe we need to provide better training or something. I'm an EVAS fan, and I know I might not be in the majority, but I totally agree with Becky and what she said with EVAS and the value it can provide a school and how it can move your educators and move your students if you know how to use it.
If I can chime in, I'm someone who should be a fan of EVAS, given that it rated me as a highly effective educator quite a bit. But here's why I'm not. And it's because it's been acknowledged, even through DPI folks, that no matter how much folks grow, whether it's schools, districts, or teachers, there's always a certain amount of folks or groups who will be defined as not effective. So what I would like to see in a growth measure is just to ensure we're being fair to schools and teachers and districts, that if we're using a model that has already decided not everyone can be seen as growing, I struggle with that, especially with this being an industry of we are trying to get folks to grow. So I would like for whatever we use as a growth measure to pass the classroom test, where if I were to say to my students at the beginning of the year, no matter how much you all grow, some of you will be labeled as just not having effectively grown. I think parents, my colleagues, and even my principal would have an issue with that. And I think that if we're not okay with something like that being communicated on a classroom level, then it should give us pause for using something like that on the state level. In regards to what to do next, there are some states that have dropped EVOS and value-added measures and have gone to other things, South Carolina being one of them. And I noticed in the notes that we were provided, we were told that the metric should not be value tables, but I'm curious about why the work group recommended it not be value tables.
Curtis, can you shed light on that question?
I think as they were looking at value tables, they were not as technically sound as other models. So they are something that, let me think through this just for a minute. I'm trying to recall the conversation. So I think, as they looked at those value tables as a potential option, that it wasn't providing that level of detail that in terms of technicality and confidence someone would have that there's differentiation in the same way that value added and student growth percentiles did.
Yeah, and I just want to be sure that we're not, in a sense, being put in a position of choosing between what's technically sound and educationally sound, and those two things feel in conflict with EVOS.
So let me try to do a little bit of framing as best I can the issue. I've heard a lot of support for EVOS from some educators who are with us and others along the lines of it's extremely beneficial in trying to, for instance, gather how a teacher performs with certain segments of students, can help in assignments. It has a lot of value in terms of getting a sense of where the school might be progressing in a general sense and sometimes a more specific sense. And so that's been a real positive thing. I guess what I've also heard is EVOS is not going anywhere. It will be there anyway for that purpose, if I heard Curtis right about that, which then leads us to the question, is EVOS then a good accountability model in addition to performing the other functions it performs that are beneficial to principals, superintendents who are trying to evaluate many things, including getting the students in front of the right teachers for them? And so that arguably is a separate question. The criticism that I've heard on that one, both here and elsewhere, has been, and I'm going to use last year as an example. Last year, there were a number of schools that increased their proficiency scores and did not meet growth because EVOS is on a bell curve. And so you actually, and this is to Kim's point a moment ago, you actually advanced your students' proficiency, but still did not find that school meeting growth because of the way the bell curve of EVOS worked. And in fairness about criticism of EVOS, it is that nobody does truly understand how it works. The formula is proprietary, and there's a lot of helpful explanations about how it works, but nobody, and Tanya, please tell me different as a superintendent, you can't sit there and calculate it or replicate the calculations for your students. You have to get that from EVOS. And so there is that we'll call it a transparency issue. It's not an issue as in you're not getting the information. It's just an issue as to it is hard to understand where the numbers come from. It's not that you don't trust them necessarily or that they're can't be helpful, as has already been discussed, but it's hard to understand how it was reached, how the calculations were reached. So the question is not, are we going to still use EVOS? The question is, are we going to use EVOS as the accountability measure tool? And should we look at other potential accountability measure tools for growth, at least to understand them, if not to use them? I don't have a good understanding myself as I sit here right now. I've seen some comments that have been expressed that are using acronyms, and I don't even know what the acronyms stand for in terms of growth. So I'm not sure all of us do. So question is, do we need to understand what other options are there for the accountability purpose, or are we content that it's okay to continue to use EVOS as our measure of that in addition to the other purposes it beneficially serves? And I sense some split in our group on this particular issue. So any kind of help on that would be beneficial. And if I said that all wrong, I know you'll correct me. Please do.
I'll go
Well,
back.
I'm glad to know that EVOS won't be going away and that it'll still be available for principals to use it and make assignments. But again, I still believe we should explore additional models when we're considering how it's used in accountability for the sake of transparency to the public and for the people, to our students and to our parents. And I'm glad we're using it to make assignments and to do things like that. But I'm still not convinced it is the best model to be used in school accountability.
And what about the NC check-ins? So my understanding from talking to some of my colleagues in the classroom is it's the data from the NC check-ins that's much more helpful for them informing their instruction with students' strengths, weaknesses, and where they need to grow. So I certainly understand not necessarily wanting to reinvent wheels, but we might have other things like the NC check-ins that could provide context for growth aside from just working it through EVOS.
We want to be careful about using NC check-ins in any way in accountability, because the point at which they become an assessment would mean it would change the entire nature of it. You would have to then make it a secure item, right? And so you could no longer use it for formative purposes. So while I think you're right, and what we want is for teachers to be able to use NC check-ins to improve instruction and to identify where students need additional support and help. I would be really careful about including those in a formal accountability system.
Other thoughts, if any?
Hi, Mr. Duncan. This is Erin Brewer. I just wanted to weigh in and echo. I think I'm interested in seeing other models as well. I appreciate, especially hearing from some of our best principals and leaders in the industry on what EVOS has done for them. I just wonder if we could also get the data that those principals could utilize even in other models. Like if that doesn't have to be marked as a loss just because we're not using EVOS. I know change management, I think, was also brought up as a hesitation, and I feel like now is the time to consider change and be affirmed one way or another on why we keep or why we make change. And so, I recognize hesitation, but I also feel like now is the moment where we need to look at what's best for students and our families and be clear on what we're providing for transparency and how it's used. And if there's other models that can do that better, I want it to be considered.
I agree with what Aaron just said and what some of the others have said. I think that I'm hearing enough, not disagreement, but just enough interest in at least having or gaining a better understanding of what other growth models might particularly be able to show us if we lose something as far as measuring the effectiveness of a value-added system versus the transparency, then I think we ought to be able to balance out or look at why we might choose one or the other. But I think that I'm hearing that we need to maybe explore other models.
Tanya, I think you put a comment in. Thank you, Janet. You had a comment in the chat. Did you want to explain or further elaborate on that?
No, I know about the bell curve and everything, but I feel like, with EVAS, I feel like it's different because it's an expected growth model, not a ranking model. So it's not, did your students grow more than most schools? It's more of, did your students grow as much or more statistically than statistically expected based on their prior achievements. So I feel like every student is working against themselves. So it's not like the normal bell curve that you might have in a, college classroom, or that's what I was trying to put in the chat.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. It sort of raises a question just thrown out, I'm going to throw out in general on the same issue. There's often been complaints on using EVAS or any other growth model, and that it only is for select subjects. So a large percentage of teachers, if you will, are not even subject to testing that would be evaluated by the EVAS model. Is that something that we should be thinking about in terms of how these models work, and that a number of educators are not touched at all by this review, or that kind of review, and that is raised often as a criticism in some respects. I'm interested in what comments folks would have about that.
Well, I agree with that criticism, but my remedy would probably not be very popular, which is we need more tests. We need more tests in more subjects, given more years.
Parents are clamoring for
Science
that.
and civics in particular.
Yeah. I'm just joking with you that parents are clamoring for more tests, but I understand the point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, parents' opinions about tests somewhat depend on how you ask the question. There's lots of polling that suggests that parents are still very supportive of test-based accountability. Just depends on how you ask the question.
Yeah. Good
Well,
thoughts.
Many of you maybe remember the day where we had a whole lot of EOCs.
Yep.
We used to have the NCFEs, and they were in the EVAS model when we did the NCFEs.
They were not part of school accountability, but yes, they were part of the educator effectiveness and being able to measure that. We did not include NCFEs in school accountability.
That's when we had standard 6 on our
Right.
teacher evaluation.
That's before then.
And I think it's important to remember, there's kind of be careful what you wish for a moment, but also the big A. And what's the purpose of the big A, and how this intersects with that, I think is a factor.
Yeah. I mean, it is a conundrum about how wide the testing is versus, to try to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. There are definite tension points in the discussion, but I think we should be aware of those and thoughtful about those as we progress.
Like to speak to Vice Chair Duncan's point as a English teacher, and one of the 4 tests that are used to evaluate our high schools. It is problematic that the only time our students are assessed in English is halfway through high school. It puts an undue amount of pressure on the teachers of those 4 courses. It has a huge impact on staffing and scheduling within departments. It affects retention in some cases when the same teachers are consistently scheduled to teach these high stakes courses year after year, because they are effective in those areas. But it also, I think, is dismissive of the work and the input and the value of my colleagues in other areas and other grade levels at present.
Others on any of these points? Then we'll see how we can do about coming to some form of a consensus.
I guess I don't know. I can hem and haw, but why not take the time to look at other models? I'm not saying that we would change it, but why not take the time? You know, we have an opportunity here.
All right. Are there others who think similarly that let's take a look? In essence, we're green to date, not to marry.
Well, I think it would be.
Take a look. Sorry.
Okay, I was thinking that it would be an excellent opportunity to take a look at some other possibilities. I know EVAS has been around for some period of time. Maybe we need some training as we attempt to try to explain it to others, and I'm sure that parents are probably never going to be able to really understand what it's all about. It's tough to understand and probably even tougher to explain. But I'm not saying it's a bad situation at all, but I don't have any problem with investigating other options.
Other thoughts, comments on whether we ask staff to take the time to do that and report back?
I don't have a problem with looking at other models. I mean, you never know, there might be something out there that is better. And with the amount of concern that has been expressed about EVAS, not just within our task group, but within the state itself, it would be good to be able to, when we land on whatever the accountability model is, it would be good to share that other models were reviewed if we were to stay with EVAS. Otherwise, they might not think we did the work that we should have done if we didn't explore other models.
So let me throw this out as a possible point of consensus that we ask to get information on other models, but at the same time ask the field groups and DPI group to take a look at, are there any places where growth is evaluated on a dual kind of standard? That is, you would keep EVAS for some portion of a growth model, but you would look at a different form of a value or a growth model as at the same time, if you will, trying to get at different aspects of growth. I'm not saying that makes any sense either. I have no idea if it makes any sense at all. But is it worth just, if we're going to explore what other growth models would look like, let's take a look at, is there any place that explores growth from more than one angle, for lack of a better way to say it? Is that palatable to people? Because I don't know if there's any states that look at it from more than one angle. Chris, perhaps you know.
Yes, Vice Chair Duncan, could you repeat that? I was just trying to reflect the notes here.
I was wondering, are there any states that look at growth from more than one angle? For example, if there was some decision or some thought that you could keep EVAS, but you looked at another growth model as well, so you tried to evaluate growth from more than one angle, if you will. Are any states that even do anything like that?
Not that I know of. Nope. They either use a value table, or they use student growth percentiles, or they use a VAM, but no state.
Would you define VAM just for?
Sorry. Yeah. So VAM
value-added model, right?
It is a value-added model. EVAS is a value-added model. It's one type of value-added model. And one maybe this this came up earlier about is it a a zero-sum game? And the answer is kind of somewhere in the middle. So EVOS, it's true that often it does place the majority of schools in the MET growth category in any given year. So you can have a majority of schools in any given year that meet or exceed growth. So that part is accurate. Where it gets a little more complicated is the underlying model. So EVOS defines expected growth as growth that would occur under average instruction. So when you're talking about in average, right, by construction, the average school value added is 0. So you can't have all schools above the state average any more than you can have all students above the median. The average is defined by the distribution itself. So that, say everybody meets or exceeds growth, that bar is going to change the next year, right? And it's always going to be subject to average. So over time, you are going to have winners and losers. That part, any value-added model is going to do that, and you can't. With a value-added model, you cannot get beyond that normative piece, right? But with value tables, you can. It's criterion-based, so anyone could meet growth or exceed growth. But then the challenge is that it is more correlated with achievement. So in some ways, you're kind of modeling achievement when you model growth a little bit more than you are with value added. Hope that makes sense.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and just coming back to your question, Vice Chair Duncan, there is no reason why you couldn't use multiple growth models. So for example, using a value-added table, right, to look at, to give you a criterion-based assessment of how much a school grew, and then also using the value-added model to look at a comparative, right, to give you an understanding of how well schools grew in comparison to all other schools in the state that are like that school. So you could do both. I think just top of my head, the one thing I would caution against there, or the tension I would see, is that it could get complicated, right? Because if you're modeling growth in 2 different ways and you get 2 different answers, that could create some confusion.
Yeah.
And I think that's
sounds conceivable. You would get some of that inconsistency.
Yes. Yeah, you definitely would. No question that where a school is placed on, in a ranking, if you were to rank all schools using a value-added table and then rank them using a value-added measure, there will be differences.
Let me ask one last question along these lines. We were talking with respect to the achievement model that trying to do some scaling, if you will. And we had some discussion about the scaling for non-proficient, if there could ever be scaling for students who are improving but still at non-proficient levels. Would that fit with a value table the way you described it, or would that have the same issues about mixture of 2 things?
Yeah, well, that's what a value table does. Is so if you take those 2 schools and one school moves all students from level 1 to level 2, and another school takes all students from level 3 to level 4, using a value table, you could give, if you wanted, more credit to that school that moved all students from level 1 to 2, or you could give more credit for all the for the students who move from level 3 to level 4. Typically, and I think almost all states that use value-added tables, they give more credit as you move up as you kind of move up from level 2 to level 3, from level 3 to level 4, right? Students get more points. But again, those are kind of two different things, because with the index approach for performance, you're giving students, you're giving schools points differentially based on status, right? Based on their performance in 1 year. Versus a value added table, you're looking at change. So what happened last year and what happened this year, and based on what happened this year to last year, we're going to assign you a certain amount of points. That answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the additional information. Curtis, did you want to add on to that at all?
No, I think that Chris has described what I think you're looking for, and we can certainly, explore lots of things if that's if that's the consensus of the group, to go look at the reviewing additional growth models and coming back with,
Well, I think maybe trying to come back to find a consensus. We've heard some support for a variety of different reasons, both from educators and from other observers, close observers of the use of that information. And there's support for its ongoing use in several quarters that we've heard from. But I think we're also hearing some openness in other quarters of our group right now to at least explore and understand what the other models would look like and how they would work. So, and one comfort if we do any exploration is for those who find the strong reliance on EVAS, I think it's going to be with us regardless. So perhaps it's worth taking this opportunity to at least find out what else would be out there and whether or not we should be seriously considering it for informational purposes, if for nothing else. Is that a fair consensus? Or is there?
Alan, I would urge people, if they haven't already, if they go to the chat and click through, Kim posted a link to one of the reports that showed the different states using different measures, growth measures, and including some that use multiple growth measures, to your original point.
Yeah.
That would, I think, help folks, if you haven't already seen that or seen some version of that analysis, to see a variety of different models used by different states, including mixtures, apparently.
Okay. Chris, if you're talking, you're on mute.
Yes, and thank you, and I'm glad you brought this up, because there is something I should clarify, and that is when they're talking about using multiple measures in this case, they're not talking about the difference between value added measures or student growth percentiles. Typically, what they're talking about is multiple measures in terms of adding a subgroup, right? So, for example, we're going to look at this in the aggregation example. But a great example is Arkansas, where they use, and many states do this, they look at the growth of the lowest performing students. So the 25% lowest performing students, how well did those students, how much did they grow? And if they grew, a significant amount more than, say, the average, then that school would get more points. So that's an important distinction, I think, and part of what this report is talking about. The other thing is, so when they talk about multiple measures, you might use a different measure in high school than you use in elementary school.
Okay. All right. Well, it sounds like it's at least worth getting additional information. Is there anyone who disagrees with that? Because I don't want us to waste time if that's. But perhaps we get some additional information, and then that will help guide some decision making at our next meeting or the meeting after. Anyone object to that? Okay. well, trying to use a consensus approach today without voting, let's, um, Curtis, we would ask you to come back with more specifics on any alternatives that you would want us to consider or think about beyond EVOS and whatever other considerations go. The growth, I think one thing this discussion illustrates is the growth model is very important to evaluate where we are and how we're progressing as a state in terms of our educational efforts. And so that highlights how important we try to get this right, to get something that's in a place where we're all comfortable with it. And as I think, Tanya, you said, would be comfortable in defending, because we've looked at all the options and we would be comfortable in defending that this is what we're doing. So any other comment on growth before we go to aggregation? All right, off we go to aggregation.
All right. Thank you, Vice Chair Duncan. I'm going to turn it over to Rupen at this point, I think, to have some conversation, a bit of a conversation before we move into aggregation with Chris.
Okay,
And-
very good. And I think I have part of that conversation.
That's what it's, yeah, I'll defer to you, Vice Chair, if you want to do that now or after aggregation.
And I can go ahead and do it now. So one of the things we're talking about is that we are taking on a lot, and we are, I think, moving forward, and we're helping by reaching consensus on these items. I think we're allowing our working groups to come back with more focus in terms of what we want to try to take a look at. The next meeting, the way it's scheduled right now, is it's in August, and I'm now flipping out my calendar to get the right date. It's on August 20th. It's a meeting by Zoom, and right now it's scheduled for 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock by Zoom. And we know that's a busy time of year for some of you educators, that school is opening right around that exact same time. So that is busy. And so the ask here is going to be twofold. And I think Rupen's going to be able to have some kind of poll. But the ask is, as of that next meeting, we would try to take a look at reporting categories. That is, we haven't really talked in depth about reporting categories in school IDs. That would be part of it, along with more on aggregation. In the ideal world, we would get a little bit into some of the other indicators we want to take a look at. There are other indicators that we've talked about, and that's documented in the task force notes, and we're going to explore those further. We're just not going to do that today. We're focused on these three today. And so we want to touch on those things then, and then so that the request would be, can we do one of two things? Expand the meeting time instead of from 2 to 5 to from 1 to 5 to help pick up enough time, still virtual. And alternatively, the question is also going to be asked, if necessary, how many could stay past 5 for a while if needed to finish that discussion. Then the second thing is, once we're starting to put all this together in September, through September, is it possible to have an additional in-person meeting where, for example, if we were trying to vote on some close issues, we would have the ability to be together and to discuss, and we would have a lot more information, and we would have people with the ability to answer our questions. And so the question would be, could we have an additional in-person meeting on either September 21st or September 24th? That would be the 9:30 to 3:30 timeframe that we've had for the in-person meetings before. And that would be in addition to our next in-person meeting after that, which would be on the 15th of October. And at that point, we're getting close to making final decisions so reports can be written. Keeping in mind that one of our goals is to be able to have something to present with a lot of backup and support, as well as our deep thought for the legislature to consider by way of an accountability standards moving forward. So we want to try to keep this on a track of moving, and we also want to at the same time give it a full consideration. And we very much value the input we get from the field and from the department. And we want to give them time to follow up on things that we're talking about, having ideas about, and getting factual support for making good decisions, whatever they might be. So I throw that out there for your consideration, knowing that all of you probably are not thrilled to have other meetings on your schedule because we're talking to a lot of busy people, but this is really important. And so I hope that we'll find a way to make as many of us find a way to make ourselves available. Rupen, I turn it to you from here before we move to aggregation.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I would just echo the vice chair's remarks that this is, I know it's not ideal, but it is tremendously helpful to DPI, to the working group, this sort of interaction. And today we saw it on display. And so what I'm going to do now is I'll ask everyone to look at their calendars. And I'm going to launch a poll right now. So you should see on your screen a poll with two questions. And the first question is around the August 20th virtual meeting and possibility of expanding that. And then, of course, the second question around the possibility of adding a meeting date in September. And the September date, as the vice chair said, would be in person at DPI as we have done in the past, 9:30 to 3:30. And recognizing that folks need to get their calendars, I'm going to give some time. I'll also say for some of you, I believe you might, I've heard at least one or two in the car. Please drive safely, and you can perhaps email me or text me after the meeting. Just a couple more minutes. We've got, I think, 14 out of 18 responses so far. And it looks like we have several responses already. Is anyone still responding and would like us to wait? Okay, it sounds like we are in a good spot with this. And Vice Chair, with your approval, we can move to Chris, who will take us through aggregation.
That would be great. And Ruben, just so everyone knows, when will you report back the likely timeframes?
With your approval, I think I'd like to send an email to task force members who were not here today,
Right.
or whom I didn't receive a response from, And then I think that by tomorrow, I would be able to send an email to the entire task force.
That'd be great, just so everyone will know when to expect something. Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Chris is asking, do folks need a break before he starts? Does anyone want to take yes, I'm getting some thumbs up on that. So, all right, let's take 5 minutes. Chris, that still gives you enough time to complete your task.
Plenty of time. Yep.
Yeah. All right. Very good. So let's take 5 minutes and we'll all just get back together then. All right, I've got 5 minutes, so I think we're ready to go, Chris. Hopefully everyone is
All
back.
right. Yeah, and one thing, I'm searching for this now, but one thing I thought might be helpful, I think this was also posted in one of your earlier readings. If you do want to learn more about growth, the best one that I can recommend, much better than the data quality campaign, partly because this really gives you more insight into the methods themselves. It's called A Practitioner's Guide to Growth Models. It was written by Andrew Ho, who's a professor at Harvard University. And I'm just going to include here in the chat that should work. But that's a really helpful tutorial about different growth models and the tensions between those growth models. And potentially that's something we can do in a later session, is go a little bit more in depth, and or that maybe something that the DPI does is look at those various models and explore the implications of those different models.
I'm sure.
Okay, so
I'm sure DPI will do that, but it will be helpful to us to take a look at that report. So thank you for giving it to us.
You bet. Yep. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay, you should all see a screen, the slide that's green. It says aggregation design principles. Is that what you see?
Yes.
All right, so this next section, I want to focus on approaches that are used to aggregate measures and indicators into that final picture of a school's performance. But before I do that, I want to level set on some terminology and how we define those measures. So what is a measure? What's an indicator? What is summative performance or summative determinations? What do we mean by those things? And so this slide is designed to just kind of level set us on what we mean by what I mean when I use certain terms. So there are individual measures, and those are things like test scores, attendance rates, which you can then combine into indicators. And those indicators represent a domain like achievement or growth. And those indicators can then combine into a single summative determination for a school, which would be the overall result or the overall score that a school receives as part of their accountability rating. And so in the brief that you read today, it was called Combining Accountability Indicators and Aggregation Methods. That brief outlines 5 approaches for combining measures and indicators into a final summative score. And the 5 approaches that we laid out in that brief included compensatory, conjunctive approaches, disjunctive approaches, profile, and a profile with filter. But what I want to do just in the next 15 minutes or so is really just focus on 2 or 3 of those. So we're going to focus on compensatory, profile, and profile with a filter. And I say 2 or 3 because really when you're making summative determinations, there are really it boils down to 2 different approaches. You can use a compensatory approach or you can use a profile approach. The profile with filter is a subset of the profile approach. So my goal is to kind of try and simplify this and keep this at a high level. And then once we level set on that, we can dig deeper and talk about various ways in which you can combine indicators and measures into an overall summative score. But I often think about this as compensatory is quantitative and a profile approach is much more qualitative. With a compensatory approach, you're basically using you're calculating a number, right? A final number, which we call an index. That index could be based out of 100 points. It can be based out of 500 points, 1,000 points, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? It's a final score that the school gets, and that final score was compiled by basically taking a quantitative result of how a school did on various indicators, oftentimes putting in a weight, right, and weighting those indicators, and then coming up with an overall score. The profile approach is much more qualitative, where you actually don't do that. You keep the indicators separate, and then you look across those indicators to say, do we see patterns, common patterns across various schools? And then can we group those schools according to the patterns that we see? And I think of it as kind of like if you were to go on a dating site. I've been married for over 30 years, so I don't go on these sites. My daughters did it, I think, tried it, and then didn't like it. But you can go on these sites, you put your profile together, right? And then somebody looks at that profile and they say, okay, the age, that's about what I want, and this person is 5'10", and I'm a tall person, so I'd like to be with a tall person. And you go through all those hobbies, I like to dance. And as you're doing that, you're also weighting it, right? So some things are going to be more important to you than others, but you're not quantifying that. You're not turning it into a final score. So what a profile approach does is it moves in that way. And it does provide a more systematic way of doing it, so that you don't come up with, so that it is, again, it is systematic, and it can be replicated. But these approaches are the approaches that states are currently using at a system level to make the summative school determinations. The other two approaches that we talked about in the brief are conjunctive and disjunctive approaches. I'm not going to address those today because both of those approaches are largely confined to the indicator level. So, for example, states often use the disjunctive rule that allows schools to meet one of several criteria for post-secondary readiness, right? You may have a menu of things that a school needs to meet, but they only need to meet one of many criteria. And so that disjunctive rule provides that menu of options for meeting proficiency on a given indicator. And then the state can apply a disjunctive rule that allows schools to only meet one option to be proficient. The conjunctive rule, on the other hand, is used at a full system. It was used at a full system level under No Child Left Behind. If you remember, I remember adequate yearly progress. I'm sure most of you remember that. This was the conjunctive rule, right? The conjunctive rule says that you must meet all of these criteria to be judged as proficient. And if you don't meet any one of these, then you aren't proficient. So under NCLB, if schools didn't show adequate yearly progress for all schools and subgroups for 2 consecutive years, they were identified as in need of improvement. And under ESSA, states moved away from that because of the fairness and over-identification concerns it created. And so that's part of why I think we can put that aside for today. We could talk about it in terms of indicators, but it's not really relevant when we think about combining at a system level to come up with a summative determination. And I'll pause there just for a second in case there are any questions. Okay. Feel free to raise your hand if you do have questions, and interrupt me if you need to. So just as a quick reminder, before today's meeting, we asked you to listen to a pre-recorded presentation on aggregation methods, and then read a brief on combining indicators. And my presentation today builds on that pre-work, and our focus is on aggregation methods for making a final summative school performance determination. So what is aggregation? It often helps just to start with the definition. And the definition that I'm using is, it is the process of combining indicator level results into a single summative score or grade or determination. So on the surface, that sounds really simple, but the method that you choose to combine those results and not just the underlying data influences the final rating. So for example, you could have two schools with identical indicator level performance that end up with different overall ratings depending on which aggregation method is used. And several years ago, we did a report for a state. I was involved in a report for a state that looked at this. What happens if we change the weights or we change some of the ways in which accountability, in which we add up these indicators to a final summative score? And the differences were striking. I mean, there were up to 30% of schools that were identified in one category that under a different method were grouped into another category. So it can make a big difference, and that's something to keep in mind. And it's also a reason why people have concerns about, it's sometimes about the grade or a star approach, because with a grade or a star approach, the benefit, and again, I'm not, I don't want to sound like I'm promoting one method over another, because all these methods have various strengths and weaknesses, right? And there's always going to be a tension. And so the tension with the grade, a final summative grade, is the positive is that it's very easy to understand. Everybody can understand A school means it's a good school, right? F school means maybe it needs some support for improvement. But where you get into the weeds is oftentimes what a good school is hidden, right? It's, what does that mean? What does A mean? What does F mean? There's really no inherent meaning in that. And so people can come up with very different ideas about those meanings, and it can be unfair to a school that receives a label like that. So, so I want to talk, before I jump into this, I want to also just mention why aggregation matters. It matters because how a state combines indicators affects what the system communicates to the public, which students get identified for support, and which patterns of performance are visible or hidden. Also, no aggregation method is neutral. So every approach involves trade-offs along the lines of simplicity, transparency, fairness, reliability, how much attention it gives to a particular outcome or student group. And to be clear about today's goal, we're not selecting a final method. We're just trying to clarify which approaches and design features seem most promising for North Carolina in a redesigned system. And at our last meeting, this task force raised some important concerns about the A through F system. Those concerns that we captured included the ideas that the current system could be over-identifying schools as underperforming, that the current system might be overemphasizing achievement status. It could be obscuring important differences across school contexts, and it's limiting the visibility into growth, into student group performance, and other indicators of school quality are limited by using just an A to F system. So those concerns suggest that the task force look a little more closely at how different aggregation methods can change both what the system communicates and which schools ultimately get identified. And so here's a closer look at those three approaches that we're going to focus on today. The first is the compensatory approach. It's sometimes called a composite score. Using a compensatory approach, higher performance on one indicator offsets lower performance on another. So for example, a lower achievement score can be compensated by a higher growth score. In the second approach, this is the profile approach. In the profile approach, indicators remain distinct. So they're aggregated by looking at patterns of performance. So again, we're talking about looking more qualitatively across indicators and then making a determination about which patterns should be classified as schools that are high performing, which are acceptable, which should move to low performing, et cetera. And then this third approach, which is a filter approach, is really a type of profile approach. And the filter approach applies a multi-stage method. It evaluates indicators in stages to identify schools, for example, progressively placing schools into groups based on their patterns of performance across several indicators. So really what it comes down to when you think about compensatory versus profile is how do you want to see the results at the end? And I want to give credit to Curtis yesterday. He made that statement and it really resonates with me. It really is about how do you want to see those results when things are aggregated at the end of the day. So I'm going to start with compensatory approaches since that's what North Carolina uses right now. So you are currently using a compensatory approach. Before we look at examples of other compensatory approaches, including North Carolina, keep these questions in mind as I walk through the examples. You can ask yourself, to what extent does the weighting structure reflect our policy priorities, or to what extent could it reflect our policy priorities? Number two is, does the method reliably identify schools for recognition, for support, for intervention? Can the system be implemented in a way that doesn't systematically advantage or disadvantage schools and districts? How does the method handle differences in school configurations, indicator availability, subgroup size, missing data, and then is the method understandable and meaningful to system users? Those are all important questions to consider when you're thinking about these two approaches. So what is the current approach in North Carolina? North Carolina, as I said, you're using a compensatory approach. All indicators combine into a single score. That single score is then used to assign a single letter grade, A through F, to the school. Achievements, 80% weight, and growth is 20% weight. So we can walk through exactly how that works, and I did that on this slide. You start with the measures. So for achievement, you include ELA, math, and science, end of grade test, plus an ELA progress measure on the WIDA Access exam. And then for growth, it's ELA, math, and science EVAS growth scores. Those measures combine into two indicators, which is an achievement indicator and a growth indicator. Achievement earns a score of 50 points for, this is just an example. A school might earn 50 points on the achievement indicator, and then they might earn a total points of 90 on the growth indicator. You apply the weights. Achievement at 0.8 gives you 40 points. Growth at 0.2 gives you 18 points. Add those together, the final score is 58, which lands this particular school in the C range. So this is a clean illustration of a compensatory approach. You can see where this strong growth score helped to offset or compensate for the weaker achievement score. And here's another example. This one is from Illinois. So this gives you an example of creating a compensatory weighted index that has different weights applied to it. So at the elementary and middle school level here, you can see ELA and math growth. Both of those are weighted at 25%. So total growth is 50% in Illinois, and that receives the largest share. Then proficiency in science, English learner progress, chronic absenteeism, and climate fill out the rest. And at the high school level, the 4-, 5-, and 6-year cohort graduation rate carries half the total weight at the high school level. And the remaining indicators you can see are spread across science, English learner progress, absenteeism, ninth grade on track indicator, and the climate survey. But it's the same idea, right? Where you're coming up with the total score for each of these measures, you're combining them into these indicators, like you can see here, and then you're coming up with a weighted average. And then here's a final example of a compensatory approach. This one is in Arkansas, and the reason we selected this one is because it actually doesn't, all of the indicators in Arkansas are given the same weight. So it's equal weight across. You can see in elementary school, there are 3 indicators. There's an achievement indicator, a growth of all students indicator, and then a growth that looks only at the lowest quartile of students. And all of that contributes to a possible 900 points. At the high school, they add a 4th indicator, success ready graduate, that captures the 4-year cohort graduation rate and post-secondary readiness. And then schools get a letter grade based on cut scores that were set through an accountability standard setting process. So, so that's compensatory. And I will, again, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me, but I'll continue moving here to profile approaches. So the profile approach works a little differently. And I've already mentioned this is much more qualitative, where you're looking across categories and then you're identifying patterns and placing schools into categories based on those patterns. So Rhode Island uses a profile with a filter, they use a profile approach. So with this Rhode Island example, you can see to earn a 5-star rating, a school has to hit minimum point thresholds across separate categories at the same time. So they do create, they do look at, you can see this first column, the achievement indicator includes ELA, math, and science proficiency. And then they have a growth indicator in English language proficiency measure, and so on. If you move across each category here from left to right. And so each of these gets a certain point value. So they do assign points at the indicator level, but then after that, they move to this profile approach. They look at patterns and they set criteria. So they say, in order to be a 5-star school, you have to have 9 or more points on the achievement indicator, 4 or more points on the growth indicator, 3 or more points on the ELP indicator, etc. And if your school meets all of those criteria except one, then you're not a 5-star school. You move down, right? Well, that lowest level, does that make you eligible to be a 4-star school, a 3-star school, 2, or 1? So this is important to note, that each school will receive the highest star rating for which it meets the criteria for all applicable indicators in this example. So it could just be one indicator that keeps you from meeting, from getting 5 stars. Okay, so California is another example. They add another layer. They calculate 6 state indicators. And for each one, they track both status, which is where a school currently stands, and change. So status is, if you can think about that as like annual performance, right? And change is how that status moved from the prior year to this year, so growth. And then you can see in the first column here, the 6 different indicators that they use: academic, chronic absenteeism, college career, and so forth. But this is how these two pieces come together in California. This current year status is the row, and then the columns show the year-over-year change. So, for example, if a school met all the criteria for very high status, right? So their performance across those indicators was very high, and the change from last year to this year was also very high. They would be over here in the far right corner, top right corner in blue, right? Because they significantly increased and they were very high. And so the current year status is the row, the year-over-year change is the column, and then where they intersect determines the color. And red is the lowest, blue is the highest. A school with a high status that maintains its position lands on green. A school with very low status that also declines significantly stays red. And then the same status level can stand or land on a different color depending on whether the school improved or declined. California does not combine these into one overall score. So their dashboard reports all 11 measures. It reports the 6 state measures and then the 5 local indicators side by side. They do it kind of like in this way where you have this speedometer. So indicator 1 you can see is red, indicator 2 for this school is orange, indicator 3 is yellow, and so on. And the way that they identify schools in the lowest 5% is they look across. So they say any school that has all red indicators, we're going to include them as lowest performing schools that need support. And if we haven't yet met that 5% threshold, then we're going to go to the next level where any school that has all red and 1 orange, and we're just going to continue moving up until we hit that 5% cut. New York does something similar. They have a defined set of indicators, which you can see here at the elementary level. They have weighted average achievement, course subject performance, ELP, attendance and student growth. And then I won't go through all the ones at the high school, but you can see that those are they do add a couple additional indicators at the high school level. And for each of those indicators, they can earn a score from 1 to 4, 4 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. And then New York is similar to California, except they use a table with level bands as opposed to colors in a dashboard. So New York builds a series of scenarios, and each one, there's a specific combination of indicator levels. Scenario 1 requires level 1 on both the weighted achievement and core performance, plus at least 1 level on growth or English proficiency, plus a level 1 on attendance. The state starts with the lowest numbered scenario, and then they work upward, kind of like California does, right? Adding schools until it reaches the lowest performing 5% of Title I schools. And every school ends up in one of 3 categories, either in good standing, as a CSI school, or as a TSI school in New York. So I will pause there. I do have some questions here that can be helpful for conversation, just to prompt your thoughts about which approach you think might be best for North Carolina schools.
Any thoughts or comments?
Well, this is John. I'm intrigued by the Arkansas model. I hadn't seen that one before. That was interesting. I fear that the New York and California type model, well, the California model I know is different, but I fear those are so complicated that you're just going to turn people off from even embracing this. But my general thought is that if we have to aggregate, which is a question, then something that allows a policymaker, an educator, a parent to see information and consider that achievement and growth are important, and whether that leads to a star or a rating or something strikes me as less important than recognizing that the growth component, whether it's measured by value added or something else, is such an important way to think about what schools and educators add to the story. And you don't want that to be subsumed in a simplistic grading model that buries that beneath the achievement level.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, John, which is that this tension, right? This is another tension between being transparent and being simple enough that all constituents can really understand. So again, it's really a trade-off, and I think the trick is trying to find the right balance for North Carolina. And obviously, you know, that balance is different for every state.
It's also my opinion, and it's just my opinion, that I would not import so many other measures in whatever we end up recommending. When I look at something like the California model or the New York or even the Illinois model that you showed under the other version, that has so many other data that are not test scores, and in particular things that could be argued as means rather than ends, or intermediate steps rather than outcomes at the end, like school attendance. I mean, very important to measure school attendance, but I'm just not sure you would want to put that into a formula.
Good thoughts. Other thoughts?
The way I'm kind of looking at this is it seems like the compensatory model would be like just saying someone's GPA, whereas the profile model would be like the report card. And if we're kind of to John's point, if we're trying to figure out what the strengths and weaknesses are, and oversimplified GPA doesn't reflect that the way something like a report card would. So that's why I prefer the profile.
Yeah, I was thinking about how within each of the models, ultimately, if we want parents to understand it and it communicate to everyone, ultimately it has to at some point be simplified for that understanding, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be simplistic in that way. And I think too, just about some of the models were too complex to really wrap your head around what that could be to a school, or to parents, or to all the users that touch it. But I appreciate the profile models that then present, you know, five star. My school's a 5-star school. My school's a 3-star school. You know, that's a language that people understand. So I think we need to think about what depth of understanding do we need to have? Is it just an overall, here's how my school is doing, and here's all these metrics where you can go deeper to see all of the different aspects? Or is it ultimately 1 5-star, or and what we want and what gets us closest to the big A that we were hoping for?
Other thoughts?
My head is sort of fuzzy on this, but I seem to recall that back when we first started the EOGs and then created the ABC system back in the 90s, that we had a more complex system where there was things that were based on levels of performance. Was it schools of excellence and schools of distinction or something like
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
And then there was also growth measures or something, but it was, I mean, there's a reason that we ended up with something simpler. That is not necessarily an argument for something simpler, but there is a reason we got there. And it was partly people's perception that this does not really convey what a decision maker might want to know, or it is the kind of information that you can make available, but you wouldn't want to make it your headline. You wouldn't want to make it your main output of the system.
Well, I think, you know, we know that the compensatory is what we're using right now. I think we all agree that it needs to be broadened or more detail. I like the profile approach because, as has been said, it gives you more indicators. It's able to tell you a little bit more, help schools to quickly identify their areas of strengths and obviously continue to focus on continuous improvement. I guess the key is, what are the indicators, and, you know, how do you recognize them? But I'm so, you know, the second question, do you think should be removed? I think the way in which we're doing it now, A to F, I don't think is the best indicator, but of how schools are doing. But and the conjunctive approach, which was No Child Left Behind, we all know what happened there.
Yeah, I always remember school in our district that had 38 indicators and made 37 out of 38 every year. So they were they were a failing school. But
Yeah.
it just seems sort of unusual you could be in that category with 37 out of 38. Yeah.
And I do think that well, I'm getting into another question on here, but I would just like to see, I like the profile approach. I think it gives us an opportunity to look at more indicators in order to show the true picture of what's going on in the school. Now, deciding on that's another thing, but it would be nice to explore it.
I think I agree with that it's nice to explore, it's nice to learn from these different models. If all we were able to do, whatever we ended up recommending, whatever ends up being adopted, simply encouraged everyone with a stake in this at various, you know, depending on how specific your stake is, to think in terms of, we want to know how the students on average are performing and how the different, as we talked about earlier, the different levels of proficiency and all that. And we want to know how much change is happening positively or negatively. And whether you aggregate those two things or not, is not irrelevant, because if you aggregate them in a way like we're doing it right now, you're sort of swallowing the growth part. But if you can lift them up so that people understand they're both important, in my own opinion, deciding how best to then blend them into something that generates blue stars or gold checks or whatever is not as important as those two. Presumably, some of you think there should be more than the two. I kind of am comfortable with those two, perhaps measuring them more broadly. But those two things need to be known about each school so that people don't do false positives and false negatives. They don't look at the current 80-20 model. They see an A school, and they say, well, everything's going great there, even though that's really a demographic matter. And you're missing a school that has a lot more challenges that posted tremendous growth last year and got a C. And that's where a lot of this energy, I think, comes from. And I think, to make my point clear, I'm not sure that the aggregation question is important as making sure that both of those things, whether it's a profile or whatever, making sure those things are both visible.
Right.
And not neither subsume one or the other, or frankly, buried in 8 others. Because I'm concerned about that. I think that might distract.
Well, that sort of goes to a discussion that we've had already, which is there any reason you can't report dual scores? That a proficiency score and a growth score, you know, to highlight the point we're talking about. Do you have to aggregate those two, or is there any reason not to report those two? Whatever combinations of indicators are used to come out with what those scores would be. Seems to me sort of a fundamental question that we've already discussed some. Should we have two different markers, for lack of a better word, for each school, as opposed to trying to consolidate or aggregate it all into one thing?
Yeah, and I'll just clarify. Oh,
Vice Chair,
I think you're going to say.
it's just, for a state accountability system, we do not. For a federal accountability system, we would have to come up with some summative score, right? That you look at those other ones that are using profiles, they still have to come up with some final scoring that puts them into the bottom 5%. They're still making a determination of a bottom 5%. You know, with that profile, they may select like as Chris was showing in one state where there's, you know, selection 1 where you're a 1-1-1 across all of them. That's still some sort of summative rating, and you pick all of them until you get your bottom 5% of schools identified for support. So you do have to do that, but in a state model, you do not. We can do, each thing stands independent. You can show them all independently and roll them into some sort of, like Rhode Island, where you have independent measures for each of them. And you can show each of them and assign some sort of scoring to it and still come up with a summative, or you can keep them all separate. So I think there's lots of options available to us. And so we'd look to hear what your thoughts are on what options we should explore. Should we go all in on all of them? Or are there certain ones you say we absolutely should not do or consider?
And when you say all of them, Curtis, just so we're clear, you're talking about all of those indicators as was in some of those states, or are you talking about something else?
So, like, we could still do a conjunctive model. It's just not an A through F letter grade. And we could, you know, there are different ways of coming up with that, not conjunctive, but compensatory. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Compensatory model.
Yeah. We don't want
you come up with something, and then it's a star or it's a check or something else. We can also do the profile method. And as you saw in California, they didn't assign a letter grade, they assigned colors, right? So you could envision that each of those indicators gets a color rather than a letter grade. You could do the same thing and basically build a report card that each indicator gets a letter grade too, so that to John's point of growth has a score and achievement has a score, and you get to see what both of those are, and you can determine if you're satisfied with that school being one letter grade for one and another letter grade for another, and how you feel about both of those things.
But I think to John's further point, there's so many things on that graph for California and for New York.
There are.
That's going to be pretty hard to follow in terms of when we're talking about trying to communicate well with the public about these schools. That's a little more of a challenge.
Sure, and that will be dependent on the number of indicators that we have included in the accountability system, right? So right now we roll up, even at the high school, we roll our college and career readiness and graduation rate in with test scores to come up with an achievement score. There's a whole bunch of things, but ultimately there's only one achievement score. You know, in the California model, graduation rate is separate, college and career readiness is separate, academic achievement on test scores is separate, and growth is separate. So there's 4. So it seems like there's a lot. We push them all into 2. Mm-hmm. We would love to hear from you on your thoughts of, are we keeping them separate? Like, is growth separate and achievement, and at the high school, college and career readiness? And what other indicators that we focus on over the next, there's already been discussions about possible non-academic indicators and other components. But how would you all like to see that? Do you want graduation rate to be part of achievement and you have an achievement score still? Or do you want to see graduation rate and test scores differently? Like you get a score for graduation rate of some sort, and you get a score for achievement and you get a score for growth. So thinking about that as the more of those little dials you'll see are dependent on the number of indicators and how you want us to push them together.
Curtis, you just raised a point about that at the federal level, no matter what, we'll have to identify that bottom 5% for intervention. And I will say as a high school teacher that I do think in terms, I know DPI has a much richer picture of what those factors are in the achievement score. But when we're communicating where needed interventions are needed to a community at large, I think there is a benefit to separating those things so that people know where their schools need support specifically, and not just a general sense of the kids aren't achieving. I think as a parent, that would be helpful if I know where I need to push in to support my schools. If kids are doing well on the work keys and the ACT, but graduation rates are low, we know specifically as a community places where our schools need support. I appreciate the clarity in those things being separate, and I think it's, or at least being delineated clearly under the achievement score as a community member.
Kim, you're sort of, what you just said confirms the feeling that I'm having increasingly during this conversation, which is that high school might lean towards a profile approach just because there are many very different measures that we use in high school and that that we have to use. It's because we can't rely on achievement and growth in high school. That's not enough. Whereas K-8 might, I guess, do we have to have them the same for the different grade levels if one works better for K-8 and the other works better for high school?
I think setting federal requirements aside at the state level, I think that is a possibility. I don't think we would close the door on that. You could have slightly different models for high schools versus it's when we go to school identification components, whether that's federal or if we make some sort of state school identification, that we may have to look at them differently. And we have some considerations to take into account for schools that span multiple grade levels. So a K-12 school, for example, or a 6-12 school, would we separate those into two components, or how would they be put together? But those are things we work out, on the back end. To your point, it is possible.
Well, in smaller counties, the K through 12 school is becoming more common and is going to become more common when you only have 1,200 or less kids in the entire district. If you can build one central school, it becomes more economical in a lot of respects. So we're already seeing that happening, and I think it'll happen some more. But that doesn't mean we can't, as you say, separate it out.
That's correct.
I guess I'm kind of on the fence here. I'm trying to work through my thoughts. I do like the idea of reporting out the indicators once we decide what they are, and whichever ones we're going to choose, and whatever we do, I do hope, and I'm not going to get into a conversation of weight, but I do hope that whatever we choose, growth is included in there. But I also like and I also like an overall score, so I'm kind of on the fence. I also like an overall, but with reporting the indicators very clearly what they are, and then giving an overall. I don't know if I'm off, Curtis. Could you respond?
No, that's entirely. And that is similar to what, if you look at Rhode Island, they do come up with that 5-star at the end, but they do show that you have to meet certain criteria, but they're still showing you what that criteria is for each
and it's important to know those criteria, that for the public to see those criteria and know, but it's also important for I believe, to come up with an overall at the end, but very careful, but make sure we report what our indicators are clearly.
Yeah, Paul, what I'm thinking about, where I'm hearing consensus is that everybody, or not maybe everyone, but that we're finding that it is a very complex thing to get down to one score. So it takes me back to Yankee Stadium. I've shared that example before. There's all this data there, but ultimately the score, and depending on what you're looking at, that might be where you're trained. And back to Kim's point of, I do think that our communities want more of what goes on in our schools. I think our educators and our students, there are really important metrics that we could provide information on, that I think most educators would like to see reflected, particularly, like in a high school where it is just so narrowly measured now. But maybe both things could be true, that's a possibility of creating it.
Hence my point of being on the fence. I mean, I think there are a lot of other indicators we could bring in, but do we want to have a long dashboard of indicators that we report out? I kind of don't see that. And I don't see that being good for parents and to view if we go profiling and have a long list of things. That's not going to mean anything to them. They'll say, okay, so what's the bottom line? As well as, I think we should report indicators, but I think we should at some point come up with a 5-star, 4-star, 2 dinosaurs, whatever it is.
Well, we're at the end of our time, and I do want to honor that because everybody's been generous with your time today. And I didn't expect that we would reach consensus on aggregation today, to tell you the truth. We're moving towards some consensus, but I think we need some more help on the subparts that we've talked about earlier to then, at our next meeting, get a little more depth into consensus and maybe some thoughts on y'all's part about what fits with what we're talking about here. I mean, several ideas have been articulated that I think nobody's particularly objected to. We just have to find a way to coalesce those, and there may be some systems out there that are better for that than others. If so, I think we're all willing to be informed or have some further discussion about. But, what I'm hearing is that we want to be transparent, which we've always said, that we want to have a growth component, we want to have a proficiency component. Exactly how what all the pieces of that are, we're not clear about at this point. And exactly how you would aggregate that, we're not clear about, although I heard some preferences for profile and from some folks already expressed. So a profile methodology. So I think that's our starting point, and we're going to have to refine that a good bit to reach a true consensus. But I don't know if that's helpful, but I hope it's helpful in terms of where we are right now.
Vice Chair, would you be amenable, would the group be amenable to given the conversations we've had and the information that we know, we can take this and move it over to the work group to dig in deeper and start working on some things and come back to you again with another round of information and just say, we spent time digging deeper and we're potentially able to eliminate a couple things or lift these things up for you all to continue to consider?
I feel some consensus of amenability to that from just looking at some nodding heads. So yes.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, let me just say I think it's right at 5 o'clock. Janet, Jill, and I are very grateful to you for your time today and for your commitment to this process. And I think the clear realization, which resonates in all your comments about realizing how important this is. So we cannot state our gratefulness to each of you enough for your commitment to this. And as you can see, we've outlined several more times for you to commit, and we appreciate that in advance. And thank you for your time today. Very grateful for it.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership.
Everyone, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.